I'll sing to all people who do me no wrong, but if others despise me, I'll just move along, and know I'll find friends in the morning.
Alright, hello and welcome everyone. We're having a debate on this House believes that travellers have been let down by the Irish government. A bit of introduction on the topic. Travellers are a minority in Ireland. They were initially nomadic, but that way of life has likely disappeared today. When exactly Irish travellers separated from the general population isn't clear. Some estimates put it at the Great Famine of 1845, others the famine of the 1740s, the Cromwellian invasions in the 1600s, and other estimates put it even before then. The first documented, the travellers first became a significant, were first mentioned in state documents in the 1930s when local authorities reported difficulties with nomadic populations when they're attempting to build housing. In the 60s, that was the first time they were officially mentioned in central government documents, with a report recommending that they be assimilated into Irish society. Because of their nomadic lifestyle, comparisons have been drawn with other groups that were previously nomadic, such as the Roma people in mainland Europe or the Scottish Show people. However, Irish travellers are a separate ethnicity to both groups. Today, they make up 0.7% of the population, or about 31,000 people. Another 2,000 are living in the north of Ireland. For years, they were granted they were looking to have minority status, and in 2017, this was granted by the government. And in 2020, Eileen Flynn became the first traveller member of the Oireachtas when she was appointed to the Seanad. In more recent years, travellers have seen some improvement, particularly in the area of education, and there have been several travellers who've gotten PhDs and assimilated into higher education. However, travellers still face many challenges, particularly in the areas of housing, education, healthcare and employment. And we have two external speakers. We have Paddy Gorman. He is an interviewer and he has been a journalist for almost 40 years. He was initially with RTE before going independent in the last few years and starting his own podcast called Paddy's Podcast. And for the proposition, we have Martin Collins. He is co-director of Povey Point, which is an NGO which advocates for traveller rights and traveller and Roma people's rights and issues and promotes their rights. Martin Collins was born in Manchester to Irish traveller parents and moved back to Ireland at the age of 2 and was part of the first attempt to assimilate Irish travellers into general society. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first external speaker, Martin, to speak.
Yeah. You can indeed.
Thanks very much.
My voice project's very
Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, and folks, it's great to be here tonight to be involved in hopefully will be an enjoyable, interesting and robust debate with Paddy here beside me. I suppose if I was a conspiracy theorist, which I'm not, I say the whole event was sabotaged tonight by the organisers, get me to a different room and didn't rush in here in a state of panic. But no, I'm not that paranoid. So the motion or the proposition is, has this Kenya failed travellers? And what I mean by Kenya is house in our own language. We too have our own language. Gammon, can't. And it dates back centuries. It's an ancient language. So Kenya means house. So has this state let travellers down? I will go a bit further and say that this state has not just let travellers down, it has deliberately failed travellers. Right throughout our existence, in fact, the first reference to our people dates back as far as the 12th century, when it was spelled Tynkers, tinker or tinkers, rather than Tinkers, back as far as the 12th century. And the reference was actually contained in a law, a punitive law, that banned tinkers, vagabonds and vagrants from coming within a certain distance of a village or a town. And we've seen that pattern, that trend continue right throughout the centuries, where the state has introduced policies and legislation which have been punitive and which have penalised and has punished our people. And the most recent one actually was in 2002 called the Housing Miscellaneous Act, We dubbed it the Trespass Act, which criminalises nomadism. Because we are an ancient nomadic group. As I said, the first reference is the 12th century, and then very sporadic references throughout history, because we have an oral tradition rather than a written tradition. So as they say, it's always the privileged, it's always the elite who get the right history and get to write it from their perspective. Somebody once says, history is always about people who own the mines, never about the people down the mines. So it's important to bear that in mind. It's the privileged, it's the elite, it's the wealthy, those of power who get to write, document and interpret history and get to do it from their world view. Okay, and that's what has happened to our people. So very little reference. But there is sporadic references here and there, as I said, back as far as the 12th century. In 2002, the state introduced that law which travellers who are nomadic, their trailers can be confiscated, better known as caravans to yourselves, folks, we call them trailers. It can be disposed of. You personally can be fined €2,000 or in prison for a month, for being nomadic. So this state has suppressed nomadism and has always defined nomadism as a backward, primitive, deviant way of life and has no place in a modern, civilised, developed country as it is generally perceived. And let's not forget nomadism. We've been nomadic globally for a lot longer than we have been sedentary. Humans didn't become sedentary until about 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. Up to that point, right throughout our history, nomadism was the way of life for groups, indigenous groups, other groups, right across the globe. The first really explicit, deliberate attempt to get rid of our people, and this is not unique to Ireland. This is a dynamic right across the globe with colonisers and their relationship with indigenous peoples, whether it's in the Americas, whether it's in Australia, with the Aboriginal people, whether it's in Maoris in New Zealand, First Nations in Canada and America. Look at the history there. Suppression, cultural denial, policies of assimilation, genocide. It was all about getting rid of a people who had their own identity, their own history, their own language. The very same dynamic has been applied here to Irish travellers, only we don't call it genocide, but I call it genocide. Because genocide is broader than just the notion of killing somebody or spilling blood. Genocide is about the elimination of a people by any means through policies of assimilation. And that dynamic has been at play here in terms of the majority population and its relationship with travellers on the island. 1963, that was the first explicit attempt in a report called the Commission on Itinerancy. They didn't even have the decency to call us travellers. It was itinerant, which is a grossly offensive term. We don't use that in our community. That term was imposed on us by officialdom, by the state. They set up a commission in 1963 comprising of about 25 people, civil servants, politicians, and of course, the clergy. Yeah. And the state and the church worked hand in glove in trying to get rid of our people. That report is online. I'm not inventing any language here to be alarmist or to be emotive. But as terms of reference, the starting point was the final solution. That's the terminology that was used in 1960. The report was actually published in 63, but the commission was set up in 61. It's been 2 years. And if you read the report, it's racist, it's genocidal, because it talks about the final solution. And it was in our own best interest to aspire to become part of the majority population. That the majority population's way of life was the superior way of life, was the more sophisticated way of life. Settled people were the more intelligent, and we were backward, we were primitive, we were inferior, and we must aspire to become part of the settled community. That's all in that report. That report was overseen by the infamous or famous, whatever you want to say it, the late Charles J. High and Bishop Charles McQuaid at the time. So that policy document did set a framework for action and understanding on travellers, which was quite problematic and quite racist. I myself, as was said at the beginning, was part of that experiment. Just about 3 miles up the road here in Finglas, we came back from Manchester in 1967, 68. I was about a year and a half, 2 year old. And we lived on a big field. It was just a big field with many other traveller families in the old traditional wagons and tents. That time trailers was a very rare commodity. And if you had a trailer at the time, you were very wealthy. Trailers didn't come really until later on. But there was a few wagons there and a few tents, and we lived on a big field. And then Dublin Corporation, as it was called then, came in and started to develop that piece of land into the second oldest traveller site in Ireland. It was built in 1968. It's now called the Villa Park there in Finglas West. And when Dublin Corporation was building that site, and I've read the material, they initially built 10 what we call tiggeens. Tiggeens, they weren't houses. So we either called them tiggeens or huts. And Dublin Corporation deliberately restricted the budget. The tiggeens were made of very flimsy material, very flimsy, very cheap material. And the whole point was that we would move in there, we would learn how to flush a toilet, we would learn how to switch a light bulb on, and so on. And we would get accustomed to this way of life. And then we would aspire to transition into conventional housing and become part of the majority population. Again, that's in the archives. That's documented. It's not me, Martin Collins, co-director, Paddy Point, coming along here today and saying this to you. It's all documented. It's all in the archives. So I was part of that experiment. But then, within a very short space of time, within a couple of years, Dublin Corporation realised that the policy and the project they set out to achieve wasn't working. And it proved one more time the strength and the resilience, the cultural resilience of my community on the island of Ireland for centuries, resisting policies of oppression, assimilation and racism. And we have survived for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then eventually, through 40 years of campaigning and lobbying, both internationally with the UN, the Council of Europe and the European Union and the Irish State, on the 1st of March 2017, the then Taoiseach Enda Kenny stood up in our national parliament and uttered those words, that our community is a distinct ethnic minority and must be recognised as such, acknowledged as such. I was in the Dáil that evening. It was a very powerful event. It was a very emotional event, a very historic event, a very symbolic event for our people. And his comments, once and for all, put to bed the notion, this racist notion and this racist ideology that I said earlier on, that we are backward, primitive, deviant people who need to be normalised and civilised by our saviours. And in this case, our saviours are the majority population. That's racist. We have fought that for centuries. So that was a very symbolic moment, a very historic moment. Now we have to build on that. That's not going to address poor living conditions. It's not going to address health inequalities. It's not going to address educational inequalities, employment opportunities. That will require a different policy response from the state. And at the moment we are working with the Department of Equality and have just launched actually the second National Traveller Roma Inclusion Strategy, which sets about tackling all of these issues: access to healthcare, access to education, employment, dealing with racism and discrimination. But also there's a very important chapter in that dealing with cultural identity. We're not reflected in our cultural institutions, in our museums, in our galleries, in our textbooks, in the school curriculum. We are still invisible. And if there is a reference, we're a mere footnote, So it's all about settled people. It's all about their history, their culture, their identity. And as I say, we're completely obliterated. That wrong has to be righted. And we are attempting to right that by working with the NCCA, the National Council for Curriculum Assessment, to have traveller culture, history and identity taught in the schools. When I went to school in Finglas West, I went for 6 years to primary. Unfortunately, I didn't have an opportunity to go to higher education, either secondary or third level. But I got the 3 hours, being able to read and write, which was very useful to me in leading on to the work that I do now. But in the 6 years I was there in St. Kevin Boyce National School, myself and my brother Michael were the only 2 travellers actually in the whole school of about 300 pupils. We were called dirty smelly knackers. We did experience a lot of racism. But we came out with the basics, which, as I say, stood us in good stead in later life. But at no stage in those 6 years was I as a traveller boy was my identity affirmed by the curriculum. All the textbooks reflected settled majority populations' values and moral beliefs. That now is beginning to change. So I won't bore you because my time is nearly up, but it's not just me, but there's independent human rights organisations like the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, the ESRI, Economic and Social Research Institute, FRA, which is a fundamental rights agency. It's a human rights body of the European Union who does a lot of research and data collection. All of these bodies, through their reports over the last 10 or 15 years, and the most recent one was actually only 3 years ago by FRA, speak to and provide the ongoing evidence that we travellers, we Paddies, we Minkeers, we're also called Minkeers and Paddies, continue to be the most ostracised, the most excluded minority on the island of Ireland. And the manifestations of that racism and the manifestations of that exclusion is seen in the outcomes. For example, I'll finish with this. I, as a traveller man, will live on average 15 years less than my settled counterpart. A traveller woman will live on average 12 years less than her settled counterpart. The infant mortality rate in our community is 4 times higher than the national average. Our suicide rate is over 6 times higher than what it is in the majority population. And in fact, suicide constitutes 11% of all deaths in our community. Only 2% of travellers go to university. So while we're underrepresented in higher education, we're overrepresented in the Irish prison population. Again, not a unique dynamic to Ireland. This is unique right across the globe with Indigenous groups who are underrepresented in higher education but overrepresented in the prison population. And again, that points to institutionalised racism in our criminal justice system. I've heard judges over the years use the word knacker. I've heard judges on the bench say, calling men Neanderthals living by the laws of the jungle. When you hear judges on the bench make those racist comments, it's very difficult for travellers to have any confidence in our judicial system. And we see the consequences of that, the overrepresentation of travellers and indeed the overrepresentation of other Indigenous groups in other parts of the globe in the prison population. So the starting point has to be an acknowledgement that racism is not a figment of our imagination. It's real. And this racism has serious consequences for people's lives, opportunities, access to healthcare, education, accommodation. And this racism is both at the individual level and indeed at the institutional level. And I'll finish with this. This has been acknowledged by the government because recently they have launched, Minister Gorman, Minister for Equality, has launched a new national action plan against racism, which does acknowledge individual institutional racism, but also recognises the intersectionality of racism. You know, gender, race, ethnicity, disability, and LGBTIQ, because all of these dynamics, all these intersectionalities exist in our community. So we have travellers who are LGBTIQ. We have travellers with disabilities. Obviously, we have traveller women. So it's looking at the intersectionality. A traveller woman, for example, there's a triple level of discrimination and exclusion. One under gender. You know, they're a woman, they're a traveller, and then they're a traveller woman. So you have these multi-layers of exclusion and discrimination. So we have made some progress. We have seen some travellers go to third level education, not as many as we'd like, get degrees and diplomas. We have 1 traveller doctor. We have 4 travellers who are school teachers. We have 3 travellers who are guards. But it's not enough. This state needs to do more, it has to do more to support travellers and travellers' access in a whole range of disciplines. And this must be done in partnership and in dialogue with traveller organisations. These policies, these initiatives, these programmes must be done in partnership with us. Long gone are the days when settled people felt they had the God-given right to sit down and make decisions about our people and we not having any input into those decision-making processes. Self-determination, self-determination. We have a right to self-determine our future on the island. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, for that speech. I'd now like to welcome the first member of the opposition and our second external speaker, Paddy.
course, yes. Hello, folks. Paddy Gorman is my name. I make a podcast these days. I think I've spent a lot of my life standing around outside welfare offices, which is where we met before. I can't remember, did I do an interview with you? No, Michael, you didn't. You were probably there organising something. Yeah, I'd be just there. As you say, travellers are overrepresented in a lot of places. Yesterday, I stood on Mulgrave Street in Limerick City. Great having the free travel now. I can go down in the morning, back in the evening, because the courts are here, the prison is there. There's no visiting on a Tuesday. But I was there also last Wednesday, and I had to tell you, remind me of what I saw last Wednesday. There's a traveller van. It is so many people are travellers, you know. One particular couple are there, middle-aged couple, and seeing their son. Then they come out, they get in their van. Then he pulls in because he's talking to somebody. And a line of traffic builds up back down Mulgrave Street. He is completely oblivious to the fact that there are working people, people who have time, people who are, you know, people who are trying to earn their living, and he is completely oblivious to that. Sorry, I'm mixing up with your cousin. It is Michael. I do apologise. Which is it? I'm so sorry.
No, it's Martin.
It is Martin. Martin, I am so sorry. Martin, I think you were showed a contempt there for the rules that were here, that you kept going on, and it didn't seem to matter, and you kind of felt confident that everybody would pay homage to you or bow down to you. Nobody was going to come up to that traveller man and say, would you ever move on? Because we're a little bit scared of the travellers now. And I think we're looking at assimilation, and you give a good case that assimilation hasn't worked. But what has happened is, what do we have now? That we have this new privileged caste of travellers who feel that they don't have to abide by the rules of everybody else. I'm there. I'll tell you what did happen to me yesterday. I'm standing outside the Limerick courts when a woman I know walks up to me. Paddy O'Gorman, she says, how are you? And I had met her before 2 years ago when she gave me powerful evidence of what it was like to be, I put it on a podcast, what it was like to be locked up with a trans-identified man in the cell in Ewing. And I also got it from two other people, two sisters who I no doubt you know, traveller sisters, because the traveller community, in all credit to them, they have a great sense of community and they know each other. But what it's like to have a man shouting at you, and he swore this all last week, I would like to shove various implements into these women. And these women were subjected to that. And they were, so she was my star witness, but she came to me and she told me she's now out. She was able to tell me that the three men, there's only one left in there now. He's now in a place called the apartments. So he can no longer spit his gendered violence and threats of violence at women. But what she said to me then, I'm chatting with her, and I said, look, I heard that your house had shots fired at it Saturday before last in Hyde Road in Limerick. And she said, actually, no, it wasn't shots. It was hand grenades, or as somebody corrected her later, actually stun grenades. And she showed me the TikTok video. And I said, well, what's this about? Why is your house under attack? You know, the feud. Okay. This is what's going on. Oh, yeah, we won't assimilate. How does feud... And I can tell you, feuding leads to so many things. Feuding leads to homelessness. If you go down to Cumberland Street there, which is where people, when they come out of prison first, is one of the many reasons, but it's a homeless office in Dublin. The travellers are disproportionately there among homeless people. Why are you homeless? Oh, well, I had to leave home because of feuding. Two lads I was talking to on Grafton Street about 6 a.m. one morning there, that was a couple of years back. Well, it's feuding has us here. This is never acknowledged, as far as I can see, by the policymakers, by journalists, by the media. Feuding, and what is the bloody point of it? I was at Trim Courthouse with some traveller lads there, this is 2 or 3 years back, and I said to them, would you ever think of calling the police? And of course they laughed at me, and I think you do understand that it's a society that's based on the model of avenging a wrong done to you, rather than abiding by the same rules. It would be considered in traveller culture to be not standing up well for your family if you didn't fight back. Now, how many men are here, actually? Would you just mind, because I'm trying to get a handle, I said it to a friend of mine earlier when I would be mentioning this, and I said, look, this is a lad in Castlerea. He comes out, he's just been bailed in Castlerea Court in Roscommon. And I said, what happened to you? Well, I got arrested last night. I broke up a caravan. Well, sure, after what they said about my sister, and she only 15. And I have no doubts that these men said something vile about him. But I said to my friend earlier, I said, what would you... And he turns on me and he says, well, if somebody said that about my sister, I'd break them up too. I'd punch them, whatever. But then he reminds me he is actually of a traveller background. But no, it's not just a traveller. There is a sense of honour. We don't like women in our lives, or indeed people who we love being traduced in that way. But would you just mind if the men here, if somebody said something really vile about your girlfriend, your mother, you know, some woman who you value, treasure in your life, would you punch that guy in the nose, or would you walk away? Who would punch them on the nose? Would anybody? Oh, you would. Fair enough. Okay. Who would walk away and say, I don't want to get into a feud with you? You would. Okay. It's difficult, but I know among traveller men, and I respect the sense of honour, and by God, I love the bravery of traveller men. They do stand up for their families. By God, they do. But this I can't think what you would say. This very culture, I think, is the thing that's bringing travellers down now. By saying you can do this, because I'll move on to that. How does this culture keep going when it's so non-functional? And the answer is, well, what we're debating is, does the state do enough for travellers? Does the government? I think the government is actually allowing a non-viable way of life to artificially keep going. That. Why is it settled people, working people, don't feud? Because you've got a job to do. You've got a family to raise. You have a mortgage to pay. You have to do all of that. I can't afford to be in a feud with people down the way. So I would back off. Now, if something really vile was said about my wife or my late mother, okay, I'd be very angry. But we can walk away. I think the traveller culture is actually bringing travellers down now. Okay, assimilation didn't work, but God damn it, I wish they'd assimilate some of the way. And there is the feuding is one thing. Education, as you say, why do travellers not get education? Again, from my time in courts, we don't have statistics on this, but if you have a family up in courts because their child isn't at school, it's almost certainly a traveller family. I can't prove that. And we don't have statistics, but that is almost certainly the case because it isn't valued within that traveller culture. Education isn't valued. And I was talking to a school teacher during the week. She no longer teaches in Finglas, but the Collinses in Finglas were in a feud a couple of years back there. Beautiful kids. Among the best students in the class were the travel or in the school. And I often find that with people who have prejudice against them. You find it with people who have prejudice. Their kids really do work hard. They excel because they're up against so much. Then one day there was none of the Collins kids in the school. What's wrong? It's a feud. Too bloody dangerous to let the kids go to school. And the teachers actually went out to one of those sites and there's men there with steel bars. They said, look, in these days there's guns. And the kids got kept home from school. Feuding is dragging travellers down. And it's being paid for by this state system that will always guarantee the income of people, no matter what they do. And I'm looking, you talk about prejudice. I mean, prejudice doesn't explain it because I did a report on this one time, and when I worked in RT, we always had to curtail things because you could do nothing that would insult Pavy Point in particular. You could do nothing that would insult, could be construed as racist, you'd be called. But I'm there with mainly African drivers, men from Nigeria and a few women, Biafra, whatever. And the point of my report was, is it a dangerous job? The main complaint actually wasn't getting beaten up. The main complaint was people doing runners. And these African men, what they would say is, we will not go to certain addresses now. We will not drive into sites. Why? Because they're traveller sites. Now, is that prejudice? Are these African men prejudiced? And I know it myself. I lived on a traveller site. They were very, very kind to me. This was near Basildon in Essex. It was back in 2011. They finally moved in. Okay, I get off the train in Basildon. I go down to the taxi driver. I said, can you take me to Dale Farm, please? And he says, no, an African man. I'm not bringing you. Why? What's wrong? Because he believed I was an Irish traveller. As an Englishman behind me says, he thinks you're a traveller, mate. He thinks you're a pikey, you know? So I was brought down that Africans do not bring racial prejudice against travellers with them. But Africans are among those who fear, and they literally prejudice, prejudge. So, okay, there's so many things. You're saying nomadism is backward, etc. I don't know. But let it survive without being artificially sustained. See, can you pay for it yourself without being artificially sustained when you don't have to, You can always end up in prison because the state will look after your kids. You'll have your housing provided somewhere different. And ultimately, this is why I'm against this segregation, is because it keeps that patriarchy. As long as the patriarchy is there holding travellers back, travellers will never escape that. And the state shouldn't be supporting that. Okay, thank you.
Cheers. Didn't go down well, I can tell. So I would like to thank Paddy for his speech, and I'd like to welcome our first student speaker, Angelina Zhao.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and members of the opposition. Today I stand before you to argue a truth that cannot be ignored. The government has failed the traveller community in Ireland. It has not only failed to uphold their rights, but has allowed a cycle of exclusion, neglect and discrimination to persist, leaving an entire community marginalised and unsupported. Firstly, systemic housing injustice. The government's blatant disregard for the housing needs of travellers is nothing short of scandalous. A 2022 report from the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission found that only 14% of allocated traveller accommodation budgets were spent by local authorities. In plain terms, millions of euros meant to provide basic, dignified housing went unused, while traveller families endured overcrowding, substandard living conditions, and even homelessness. Now, the opposition may argue that this issue lies with the local authorities, not the national government. But this is a shallow deflection. The national government is responsible for oversight, for ensuring that allocated funds are spent as intended. The fact that these funds go unspent year after year reveals a deeper failure. The government's unwillingness to hold local authorities accountable. Moving on to education. Education becomes a broken promise within the traveller community. Education should be the great equaliser for traveller children, but it has been a tool for exclusion. Only 13% of travellers complete secondary school, compared to the 92% of the general population. And why? Because of the systematic failures, inadequate fundings and poorly implemented policies. Statistics show that tragic consequences of inaction. 86% of travellers report feeling excluded from school. This is a reflection of a system that has failed to create an environment of safety and exclusion, as well as mental health crisis ignored. The health disparities faced by travellers are a national disgrace. As Martin said, life expectancy for travellers is 15 years shorter than the general population. Suicide rates are 7 times higher for men and 6 times higher for women. These are not just statistics. These are lives lost, families shattered and communities grieving. The opposition might argue that these issues are complex and rooted in cultural differences or lifestyle choices. But let me be clear, this argument is both offensive and untrue. Health disparities are the direct result of systematic inequality. When travellers live in unsafe conditions without access to proper healthcare, and when they face discrimination in hospitals and clinics, how can we possibly place the blame on their culture? The government's failure to provide culturally appropriate healthcare services is at the heart of this crisis, and no amount of victim blaming will change that. A history of neglect and empty promises is what the traveller community faces. The chairperson, Mags Casey, of the National Traveller Mental Health Network pointed out that there has been over a decade of ignored recommendations for culturally inclusive mental health services. The supposed promises from the government that have been made, but they remain hollow with no meaningful plan to address this crisis. This is not just a failure by the government, it is a betrayal. And cultural erosion and discrimination. In 2017, Ireland did formally recognise travellers as an ethnic minority, and this was indeed a historic moment, but recognition means nothing without action. Travellers still continue to face widespread prejudice, with 4 out of 5 travellers believing that they are discriminated in their everyday life. This 2017 Act was a moment of hope for travellers and a sign that perhaps their voices are being heard. But we can clearly see that this hope has still been replaced by disappointment, and that the government's inaction has proven that symbolic gestures without meaningful change are not always enough. If anything, the government has deepened the wound by raising expectations that only let them fail. Ladies and gentlemen, this debate is about more than policies. It is about people. The traveller community is not asking for special treatment. They are asking for fairness, for dignity, for the basic respect that every human being deserves. If the government continue to let down travellers, it sets a precedent for the government letting down and failing every other marginalised group. How can the government claim to be building a multicultural, inclusive society if they cannot address the injustices faced by one of our oldest communities in Ireland? The choice before us is clear. Will we stand for fairness and equality, or will we allow this shameful failure to continue? Ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to support this motion, not just for the traveller community, but for the Ireland we aspire to be. An Ireland where no one is left behind, where diversity is celebrated, and where justice is more than just a word. Thank you.
So I would like to thank Angelina for that speech and welcome our final speaker of the night, Chairperson of our Society, Jamie O'Mahony.
Good evening, everyone. And so it falls to me to close for the opposition on this argument of whether or not Irish travellers have been let down by the state or not. Now, as John outlined, the history of travellers within the Irish state is long and complicated. It is true that travellers do face, from birth, a more difficult life than the rest of us in this room. However, the crux of what I want to lay out in the 7 minutes allotted to me is the degree to which this difficult situation in the world is self-inflicted and does not stem from external pressure, and certainly not persecution from the state. I want to begin by outlining some numbers. 28% of travellers leave school before the age of 13, as opposed to only 1% of the rest of the population. Only 8% complete a leaving cert, compared to 73% of non-travellers. In terms of law and order, travellers make up 0.7% of the Irish population, but 10% of its prison population, and with women, this figure rises to 15%. In 2022, the national unemployment rate was 8%, while the unemployment rate amongst travellers was 61%, a multiple of almost 8. Sadly, as Martin mentioned, the life expectancy of a traveller man is only 61.7 years, a whole 15 years less than the general male population. Strangely, however, all of these figures, while being recognised as disadvantages, are often attributed to the rest of us and not traveller culture itself. Now, I come from Limerick. The town of Rathkeale in County Limerick is renowned for having a very large traveller population, roughly 40%. But here is an exercise that all of you can try for yourselves. Google Rathkeale Christmas policing policy, and you will be fed a number of articles from the Limerick Leader that is put out at the end of November every year, outlining the extra policing that Gardaí have to implement in this area every Christmas because of the influx of travellers coming in from Britain every year. And so I asked the question, why does this have to happen? Is it because the guards randomly decide to lock up travellers for the crack, or is it because there is a surge in crime in this period? Now, over the summer, I read of the Dooley case. This was the tragic murder of Thomas Dooley by members of his own family. The details of the case included the fact that the murder was an honour killing, sparked by the refusal of Dooley's daughter to marry the son of one of his killers. The idea that the daughter herself would have had a choice in this matter seemingly did not come into the minds of the killers. She was her father's property, and her refusal to marry was his crime. And frankly, I think this is a medieval way of seeing the world. Furthermore, elements of traveller culture, such as their lack of family planning, with marriages at a young age and very large families, are certainly not variables that lead to a prosperous existence. There are multiple cases of outright refusal of social housing by Irish travellers, choosing instead to live, for example, in halting sites, where of course the living conditions are going to be worse, as Angelina outlined. And such an ingratitude for assets that could have such a stabilising and improving influence on their lives has to be called out. A culture in which arranged cousin marriages are commonplace, family feuds erupting into violence are normal, and in which education is not encouraged, is not the fault of the government. For the government's part, you have the Prohibition of Incitement to Hatred Act 1989, the Unfair Dismissals Act of 1977, and the Employment Equality Acts and Equal Status Acts. They all specifically identify travellers as a protected group. Travellers are entitled to all the social welfare the state has to offer, including job seekers benefit, disability payments, free upskilling courses, medical cards and pensions. And, remember the large families, those enormous double payments of child benefit in November and December all lead money flowing to this community. Travellers were given special ethnic minority status in 2017, further enshrining their ability to contest legal action against them on the basis of racial discrimination. Now, Senator Eileen Flynn was the first member of the travelling community to serve in the Oireachtas. However, she was not elected. She was one of the Taoiseach's 11 nominees to the Seanad. And this is simply representation in the Oireachtas for the sake of it. It is not a personal slight against her. However, her appointment to the Seanad was simply a diversity pick. Since being in the Seanad, Senator Flynn has spent an exorbitant amount of time speaking about the trials and tribulations and difficulties the travellers face at every turn without there ever being the slightest bit of introspective thinking. And this is an inherent mindset of victimhood. And this mindset reminds me of the words of Charlie Munger, a former business partner of Warren Buffett, who at the age of 31 had lost his marriage and his savings in a divorce and had lost his son to leukemia. He had every reason to feel like a victim. Yet he made a huge success of his life, and when speaking about victimhood, said, "It's very counterproductive for an individual to feel like a victim. It is a disastrous way to think. It may feel good in the short term because it puts off responsibilities, but in the long term, it can only ever cause misery and a sense of enslavement. And from a position of self-pity, you are guaranteed to never improve yourself." Now, Mr. Collins' organisation is Pave Point. They are a state-funded NGO who represent and are activists for the traveller community. I want to repeat the term state-funded. This means they receive each year a sum of money from the government for their activities. But the logic of this is wrong to me. The state is continuing to fund, preserve and defend a way of life that is self-evidently harmful. When a culture has elements within it that are clearly self-destructive, it is not the duty of the state to try and mitigate that. More funding for traveller NGOs is not going to eliminate that disadvantage, which clearly arises directly from the traveller way of life, not external discrimination, which are the points the proposition will make. Jared Kushner, a former White House advisor, spoke of this very principle of rewarding and incentivising failure regarding giving foreign aid to countries that continually stagnate. Quote, "All of the aid that has been given is an entitlement. It's not conditions-based. It's simply a giving over of money with no expectations attached. But if you make the aid conditions-based, fight for transparency and demand improvements, that is a positive step, and I think the same principle should apply here." What I see, sadly, among the traveller community is firstly an enormous lack of gratitude for the olive branches that have been extended so many times by the state, from social welfare to work programmes to healthcare or free education, but secondly, a dogged determination to not change their way of life, not to improve, not to obey laws, not to gain lawful employment, and not to assimilate. For these reasons, the burden of change or betterment does not lie at society's or the government's feet. It rests solely among the traveller community themselves. On these grounds, I do not believe that Irish travellers have been let down by the government. On the contrary, it is the government and the state at large who have been let down by travellers. Thank you all for your attention.
I'd like to thank Jamie for his speech, and that brings us to the end of this debate. We are going to have a short 10-minute break and then we'll reconvene for Q&A.